I would like to take the time to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Butts. Jeffrey is the director of Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, SUNY University of New York, and senior research advisor at the Vera Institute of Justice in New York City. Previously, he was a research fellow with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, director of the program on youth justice at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., and senior research associate at the National Center for Juvenile Justice in Pittsburgh. Since 1990, Dr. Butts has managed $10 million of research projects and published 2 books, dozens of monographs, and reports for government agencies and foundations, as well as articles in academic and peer-reviewed journals. He began his career as a drug and alcohol counselor with the juvenile court in Eugene, Oregon. So that's the bio, but what I know about Dr. Butts is he's incredibly knowledgeable on this subject and has been incredibly available as we've gone on this journey of development. I pick up the phone and Dr. Butts has been helping me think through this Positive Youth Justice Initiative. He's just an email away, and I've appreciated his ability to kind of help us think through how we roll out our Positive Youth Justice. So Dr. Butts, we'll have you now. Thank you.
Good morning. Everyone's been so nice at the foundation and welcoming and complimentary. I really think my best way to protect my reputation would be to go home right now. I did start out in this field, and I appreciate hearing where all of you work. I often do that when I do talks, is to ask people to raise hands, and I'd like to get a sense of the distribution of organizational affiliations and professional backgrounds. And this is a nice, there's a heavy emphasis on probation, obviously, but I like the fact that hearing of the different sectors in education and boys and girls clubs, and when you think about the partners that are here, it always comes down to that test of that phone call comes at 2 in the morning and your 14-year-old has just been arrested. Who do you want in the other side of that wall, the other side of the organizational boundary, dealing with your 14-year-old? And I think when you imagine that, we always imagine multi-sector, interdepartmental, cross-professional. We also assume that room is filled with people who are compassionate, perceptive, intelligent, dedicated, humane, all those things that are easy to find when you put out a job announcement for a beginning position. But that's what we all dream of when that call comes and it's your 14-year-old. I had a conversation with my 81-year-old mother recently, and she still doesn't quite know what I do. She'll say things like, well, that must mean a lot to the kids you work with. And I say, Mom, I really haven't had an actual young person depending on me in a professional capacity for almost 30 years now. That is where I started out. My brother, on the other hand, knows that I have a PhD and do research, and he once admitted to me that he thought I spent my day in a white lab coat, because that's what researchers must look like. So it's an interesting field we all work in, trying to blend the knowledge and lessons of research with these complicated, often dysfunctional bureaucracies we all have to tangle with and try to make work somehow. And I guess, I mean, people say I'm knowledgeable, or, you know, and I always say it's sort of like, you know, the lemmings marching toward the sea. Eventually, you're in the game so long, you end up in front. And I feel like that sometimes. I've been doing this now for about, my first job in Eugene was in 1980, so I've been doing this more than 30 years. And I see some of you out there who probably have resumes as long. And when you stick in that field, in one field for a long time, you get to understand all the subtleties. You develop a sense of history, steps that have been taken before, mistakes that are made. You also tend to recognize patterns. Almost like in a meeting and you hear someone make an argument, you think, oh yeah, I know where that argument's coming from, or I've been down this path before. So you develop a certain, is this my water? Okay. A certain sense of history, and some of the competence is just from having been in the game for a long time. Because there's always a tension. I once did a talk and I said, you know, again, the conversation about evidence-based practice and whether something's research-based or not. And I said, to me, the main fight is not between evidence-based and not evidence-based. It's about easy solutions versus hard solutions. And we tend to always go for the easy solutions. Or you might want to call that easy/cheap. So in a conversation about policy and practice and interventions, I always tease my father, my late father, when I go through his house now and I look at the stuff he did to that house, and I know his first criteria were, what's the cheapest? So the laminated surface on the bathroom sink is now curling up that he put down 25 years ago. And I think sometimes that's how we run youth justice systems and social welfare systems, is whatever we can do that's cheapest, we'll do that. But what if that wasn't our main goal? And what if the main goal was to serve your 14-year-old after that phone call comes in the middle of the night? And when you get in a conversation like that and remove all the preconceived notions and budgetary restrictions and all the real politics of, you know, we'll never get that past the council, what would the solution be? And I think when you dream up your ideal solution for your 14-year-old who's just been arrested, you naturally come to what Sierra's calling positive youth justice. You naturally think up an intervention which is supportive, which is strong. So you have to have some structure and some strength to keep the behavior from getting out of control. But you know that when you're dealing with a 14 or 15-year-old, all 14 and 15-year-olds are testing boundaries, testing everyone's patience, taking chances, acting like nothing can touch them. That's just adolescence. And you want to build a little cocoon around that while helping guide them toward a life that they may be able to survive in. That's what we all want. And that's not probation. So, and I think anyone who's been in probation for a long time knows that you need tools beyond your own office in order to really pull that off. And that means partnerships with schools, with recreation services, with Parks and Rec, with job placements, with health services, with reproductive health, with certainly behavioral health, and all these things, all these challenges that young people have. No one thinks the solution to all problems to a troubled adolescence is come to my office once every week and check in, and I'll see how you're doing, and we'll, you know, check that box that we made our face-to-face contact. So we all have bigger dreams than that. But how do you turn that into an actual intervention program or intervention approach is the challenge. So I loved it when, I guess Matt called me first and said that you were launching this new initiative, and usually I spend about 5 minutes on the phone trying to sort out who's, you know, what someone's asking me and how far apart we are in terms of assumptions and approach. And I didn't feel any distance at all when you started describing what the foundation was doing. And so the fact that it's called Positive Youth Justice and the fact that I'd written this report with a couple colleagues a few years ago was really exciting to me and really gratifying. If anyone here has ever worked in research or been around academics, you know sometimes they get caught up in their publications and the whole goal seems to get that article in a good journal. I was in a meeting yesterday with a colleague I've known for a long time, and she was saying something about the goal of this project should be to really, I forget how she phrased it, but it was basically, we have to make sure that our scientific peers respect this work. And I said, I really don't care about that. And we sort of had a little tango for a while, and I don't think we were far apart, but I was saying what I really care about is advancing the cause. I am a partisan in this fight. So I do see this as a fight of trying to create a system for responding to youthful offenders and kids in trouble or justice-involved youth, whatever pseudonym you want to use or synonym you want to use, euphemism, that's the word I was after. Creating a system that can be effective. And that's not always a question of science. And if you try to stick to the path of proven interventions and evidence-based practice, you're never going to get to the goal because we can never and will never afford to spend that much money on research to answer all those questions that are relevant to this topic with the high level of precision you need to get in the best academic journals. So pursuing academic prestige is not a solution. It's sometimes necessary, and sometimes it's necessary for marketing purposes, but I would much rather focus on what is really necessary in order to change systems. And that's why we wrote this report. I started talking about youth development as a principle for youth justice probably almost 10 years ago. And at the time, I used to describe myself as being rapidly graying, and now I've passed the stage of gray and heading right down into white. There's almost no color left in here. But as I started feeling older and you've been doing this for a while, you get to the point where you just don't care anymore about subtleties and nuance. You just say what you think, which is a really nice stage of life to reach. And when I started saying what I thought, I realized I was no longer interested in trying to couch my statements within categorical, groups and the right labels and what's the next grant solicitation coming out. I got to make sure I get in that. I just started saying what I think should happen, and I was having those conversations with a lot of people who'd been in youth justice for a long time, and I found myself constantly backing up and saying, no, but that's not exactly what I mean. Or they would say, yes, adolescent development, very important, and that's why we need more therapeutic treatment programs. And I said, well, yeah, but that's not exactly what I mean. Adolescent development is not all responsive to therapy. It's part of it, and for some kids it's a major part of it. But we need some way of talking about an intervention approach which is responsive to adolescent development, which could be evidence-based one day, but would be more global, more positive, and that word positive kept coming up. So my colleagues, Gordon Bazemore, who's from Florida, and Andres Moreau, who was at Chapin Hall when I was there in Chicago, started working on this. And I was always thinking about people I've had conversations with about this, judges, probation workers, service delivery people. And we wanted to write something that spoke, that sort of closed that gap, and this is what we came up with. So basically the question is, how do we reduce youth crime, prevent youth crime, and what's the theory we're operating under? And I don't mean theory in any kind of academic way. Theory is a way of saying, this is how I think the world works. I think A causes B causes C, which leads to D. That's my theory. So what is your theory? Most of the time we focus on risk factors, but I think increasingly we all recognize protective factors are just as important. And if you focus on any of these, there are a lot of choices. You could see a whole program built around just one of these things, and that's usually how we work. Someone in a position of authority decides that the whole answer to youth crime is substance abuse, or poor decision making, or defiance. I know in my own case, I had a pretty chronic case of defiance well into my teen years, and I think a lot of young people have that. But you could see that there's a lot of choices to be made, even if you just focus on risk. When you start focusing on protective factors, there are just as many, if not more. All of these things you could see coming up in a conversation, they're all relevant, they're all pertinent, and I think if it were your 14-year-old again, you'd want to have an intervention system that delivered all of those protective factors to your child. The question is, how do you focus interventions? How do we start narrowing in? What's more important? How do we make choices? And that's a big question. And we, at this time, do not have, I wish I could tell you that there's a perfect research base. You can go and read all the articles and it leads you to an answer and a clear conclusion to all this. But it's still a conversation going on. It's a real mix of factors. And the worst thing is the search among all these factors and the attempt to boil these down into some kind of intervention program is not engaged in by people who are completely disinterested in their own situation and just trying to find truth and justice and everything else. This conversation is engaged in by people often with a stake in the game, with bills to pay. But we know a few things that have led to this conversation. I'll just skip through these. We have to accept the importance of the research base we now have on brain research and adolescence. It's been profound. It changed, I think, the way the Supreme Court thought about the decisions over the last couple of years about death penalty, and we may see it happen again with life in prison for juveniles. It's really, we now have enough science that I think even a state legislator who 20 years ago would have not considered this idea recognizes that a 14-year-old is not the same thing as a 17-year-old, and a 17-year-old is not the same thing as a 20-year-old, and adolescent development continues sometimes, often well past the age of 20, that it's a continuum, and a state legislator does not have the requisite knowledge to say, on this day you become an adult. And I stopped using the word juvenile a long time ago professionally, because to use the word juvenile means I'm allowing a state legislator to tell me what a young person is. That's why I use the word youth. And I think if we have policies for youth justice, we should pursue those policies and those programs regardless of what age a particular young person has reached. When you hit, in New York, and this has to be true in New York, on your 16th birthday, you're an adult to the New York court system. I don't think any reasonable person would say on your 16th birthday, we stopped thinking of you as a human information, and you're now a full-fledged adult, fully accountable for your behavior, and we'll treat you just like a 40-year-old. So we have to, at some point, set aside legislative distinctions and say, what do we want for youthful offenders, court-involved young people, and I don't care if they're 17, 18, 19, or 20. Now, at 40, there's some point where that concern ends, but it's a very porous boundary. But brain research has allowed us now to say with some certainty that that's all true, and that kids are different, and they do think the same way. And the most important thing about brain research that's come out in the last 15 years or so is the distinction between information processing and judgment. And I'm certainly not an expert in this field, but I've read some of it, and it's very persuasive when you read. One of my favorite studies was done by Larry Steinberg and some colleagues whose names I can't remember, which is horrible, but I know Larry. The driving simulation game. Probably some of you know about this study, where they had kids, adolescents, sit down in front of a fairly sophisticated driving game, and so car driving. And you could earn points by taking chances on the road, trying to pass that truck, going faster. And you earn points. You lose points, obviously, by crashing, running into things. And the distinction was, I forget the details now, but it was something like maybe 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds, and they tested it with 25-year-olds and 30-year-olds. And the teenagers were just as good as the adults in making choices and determining the risks and the benefits of behavior, being cautious, and knowing how to play that game when they played it by themselves. But then they put three teenagers in a room together to play the game, and their willingness to take chances and risks in a way that ended up losing the game because they took too many chances went way up. Yeah, and anyone who's raised a teenager probably knows that very well. But we now know things like that at a level of scientific rigor which helps solidify that message, that adolescence doesn't end when the state legislature said it does. The other important one is the bottom statement there, which is adversity and stress can, it says down-regulate, which means sort of suppress functioning, and of the areas of the brain which allow for adaptive behavior, and up-regulate the emotional centers of the brain. So the things that make you just go off on something and react instinctively and emotionally are made worse if you live in an environment of stress and adversity. And I don't think we have to think very hard to understand what effect that would have on court-involved young people. Crossover youth. I was just saying earlier today, I sometimes think this is overplayed. There's a definite increase in the possibility of a young person being removed from their own home if they've already had child welfare experience. And I've heard researchers talk about this before as the stigma or the placement taint. Like once you've been removed from your home at age 6 on a child welfare matter and you get in trouble as a teenager, the system, we're just more likely to see that young person as a placement case than someone who's not been placed. And also the fact you've been in child welfare means you've been exposed to family trauma and disruption and uncertainty more than other kids. So it's an increased risk factor, and it creates a subset, a unique population within juvenile justice. But it can sometimes be overplayed. I've heard people say they're all the same kids. Not all delinquency is a function of child welfare involvement. So it's a Venn diagram. We have overlaps. We have some kids that were involved in both systems, others who come into delinquency who've had no child welfare involvement, no social service contact as children. Adolescence means you take risks. And I always think of this story, and I remember this moment in my own teenage years, where I grew up in Ohio, in a smallish area, a rural area of Ohio. There was a road that was about a mile long, that was very curvy and went straight down a hill. And at the bottom of the hill, it ended in a T. And myself and some of my other brilliant, insightful adolescent male friends started having a contest to see who could drive down that road the fastest. And I remember I was behind the wheel of a car with 3 other kids, and I was in reach of the record. And I remember heading down that hill, getting to that T intersection, still accelerating, going really fast, not really thinking ahead of what I was going to do when I reached the end. And the T intersection was to a state highway, 2-laner, but it was still a state road. And I remember that moment, and even reflecting on it for a second, thinking, boy, this is really stupid. But my friends are in the back, counting down, counting off the seconds, and I plowed through that that T intersection and went into the field across the road and drove up on someone's lawn, and Even at the moment, I realize this is really dumb, but you get so caught up. And to make decisions like that in adolescence is not an unusual thing. And it depends on what the environment is and what risk factors you're around. And I was behind the wheel of a car. Other people have a firearm in their pocket, and they're with the same amount of judgment ability. And I got off in this tangent, but thinking about the child welfare topic, is that when you've been in systems before, there is an increased propensity, but adolescence is the common denominator, not child welfare. But when you look at the numbers, kids who are involved in child welfare have a higher probability of being arrested, but it's not enormously different. It's 27% versus 17. This is from a study by colleagues of mine actually at John Jay, Kathy Spatz-Whittam and Mike Maxfield. They tend to be younger at the first arrest, but again, you can see there at 16.5 versus 17.3 years. And they tend to have a higher probability of being arrested for a violent crime at some point in the future, 18 versus 14. So it's like all the other risk factors we talk about. Substance abuse, mental health issues, family violence, school failure. All these things are markers that when you look at a record, they should alert you to there's an increased probability that this kid's going to be in trouble in the future, or this is going to be a difficult case to work. But when people say they're all the same kids, they're not all the same kids. Delinquency is a different phenomenon, and it's much more pervasive than child welfare involvement. But keeping in mind, the crossover youth are a population of interest because they're at higher risk, just like drug-using youth, as I said before. If our goal is effectiveness, I use that word agnostic because I really think we have to approach system design, policies, intervention from a position of, I don't know if any of you read John Rawls in college, but he had this phrase, the veil of ignorance, which is the best way to ensure justice is for all of us to decide how society should work, and the veil of ignorance is not knowing what our personal stake is. We'd have a very different tax system if the taxes were derived by all of us in a room not knowing who the rich people are. If you didn't know you were rich and someone else was poor and we all had to vote on taxes, it'd look very different. So the veil of ignorance in juvenile justice policy is we should build a system that we can think about as being effective for your 14-year-old without knowing that you happen to be the executive director of a nonprofit that depends on contracts from the state to do drug treatment. Somehow to set that aside and think what's a good system. Just to advocate one intervention over another because that's the business we're in, or I got to pay my people, and therefore I'm going to say that our approach is the best approach, is really, to me, morally questionable. And I know we all live in the real world and have to worry about things like that. But our central goal should be to design that system again for your 14-year-old. That call comes in and you want a system ready for your child. And basically, we need to focus on both risk and protective. And that's partly just logical, that you have to cover your bases and not just focus on what the bad things are in life, but how to build up the good things, the assets. The other is to focus on family resources and community partners, and that's a question of economics. There will never be a time, certainly not in California in our lifetimes, where states have enough money to build comprehensive systems with paid public employees doing everything you need to do to help every young person who's in trouble. So just as a matter of reality and economics, we have to have community partners, have to have public-private partnerships, and even beyond paid reimbursable services, partnerships with community groups, neighborhoods. I was at dinner last night with some folks and we were talking about faith-based programs. And I've learned my lesson in the past doing research that a faith-based program is a tremendous asset for getting people to come back to the meeting and keeping people at the table. I think we make a mistake when people think the faith-based component itself is the intervention, but there's nothing like a group of people who are at that meeting because they're motivated by belonging to their faith community and to keep coming back to those meetings and sticking with the kids. So that's a partnership I would invest in. Anything that's involving neighborhood resources, community partners, we use the phrase normalizing, where a kid's going to experience that. It's just part of living in the neighborhood. Oh, I know that guy, he lives down the street from me and now he's offering to be my mentor. Much better than I'm a state employee and I'm assigning you your mentor. So somehow to build those partnerships, but it's hard work, and I think that's why it doesn't happen very often. And lastly, this is a huge discussion which I could go on and on with, but the evidence-based movement. We do have a responsibility to do things in a way that are measurable. You can say whether they went well or not, and leave that trail of breadcrumbs behind for future people who are trying to build a program just like it. And that means doing research, collecting enough data, showing impact. But that's different than what I would call crude evidence-based that we hear a lot right now, which is I have to be evidence-based, show me the list of evidence-based programs and I'll make it fit. And that's happening a lot in youth justice, and some states, like the one just to your north, actually passed a state law saying you cannot have a contract unless you're an evidence-based program. And I'm very concerned about that. I usually talk about in groups a phrase, the political economy of research. People forget that research is a competitive business too. There are a lot of us out there scrounging for research dollars, trying to get contracts and grants, and there's, to me, it's not coincidental that most of the research money in youth justice has flowed into studies which involve models which by definition are centered around talk therapy. Because you can do a really nice, rigorous, controlled study if your model is come into my office, sit in the chair across from me, and let's talk about things, and it's 50 minutes, it's time for you to go. You can control that environment, you can randomly assign people, you can measure all the interactions. It's a very nice thing to study from a publication point of view. If your model is involve the mentor, get that church group involved, and get them into the Parks and Rec program that does hiking on the weekends, have some work experience. You're all over the place, you're working with people who aren't going to do your research protocol, people who aren't even being paid. It's really hard to do a rigorous study of that kind of intervention. So we don't have evidence-based models. But that's not the same thing as saying they don't work. Those programs, I believe, that little scenario I just gave you is the way we should attack youth justice, being supportive and creating all those opportunities for young people. But we don't have the research on that. And it's what I call crude evidence-based policy is when you just look at the shopping list of already proven programs and pick one from column A. I don't know how we're going to protect our field, but part of the reason we wrote this report is to say, let's start doing this. Let's make this into an evidence-based approach. And I think it's gaining steam. It's kind of exciting right now to be talking about this with a foundation. I think you're actually the leading foundation on this right now. I've heard things from Casey that are more compatible. I know Robert Wood Johnson's always talked about health, but we can get into that discussion about how they approach this population. But we need people who can support initiatives just like you're embarking on to create the evidence necessary to show that this approach is effective. It has to be evidence-based, but we have to build the evidence, not just purchase the evidence. And the other challenge we have to get past is this implicit assumption that mental health services and drug treatment are all we need to do. Now, I worked a lot on drug treatment programs and collaborative efforts. I did a site with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. One of the sites was in Santa Cruz called Reclaiming Futures, where the whole thing was to try to coordinate behavioral health and justice services and make a better fit so that we don't miss drug problems. Better screening and assessment up front, quicker interventions, more appropriate interventions. And so I do think that's part of the puzzle. But it's not the whole solution to why kids get into trouble. I think positive youth development is a more universal, sort of global explanation of how kids get into trouble and how they get caught up in these systems. And to build an intervention approach around positive youth development, this is the way I would summarize it, is just you focus on strengths and assets. So if a young person comes to you and all they're talking about is music, well, use that. Let's find a way to get them involved in some kind of something where they maybe do their own mixes and put it up on YouTube, show them that their friends found it, something that like fires that spark of interest in something that could be a positive force in their life. Attaching, engaging, and socialization. That's how all of us survived. That's why we're here in this room today, is that someone cared. We found something during our early years that really got us passionate about something, and we stuck with it. And all young people need that. And usefulness and belonging. Both of my parents were music teachers. My friend Jennifer and I were talking about piano lessons as children. I hated them too. But I did play saxophone and oboe. I didn't even have a choice. I was just informed by my father that I was going to play the oboe. But I did have that group to belong to all the way through high school. And I think, again, all kids need that. And broad systems of community-based supports, it has to be partnerships. And basically, when you boil it right down, positive youth development is saying that every kid needs what wealthy kids take for granted, which is good relationships, being rewarded for work, skill development, knowing what it feels like to learn something new and have someone say, wow, how did you do that? That's really great. Every kid should have that once a day. Physical activity and sports, for all the reasons, all the metabolic reasons and group behavior and everything else. Music and the arts, civic engagement, political involvement even. I was in Anchorage, Alaska, working on a project there, and one of the best stories I heard that to me support this approach, I was doing a study there on their youth court or teen courts, which I still believe in as a good model if it's done correctly. And their youth court was so organized that they had a youth bar association that was very organized. The kids were in charge of everything. And that had an outgrowth, it had a side effect, that when they had a bunch of arrests of kids that were skateboarding in downtown Anchorage, where they weren't supposed to be doing that, and the police were just writing tickets. The young people from the youth court got together with some other people from the various high schools, created a proposal, went to the city council, and presented a proposal with a budget to build a skateboard park that was near downtown. And the city council approved it. It wasn't some cute thing that the adults dreamed up and then pushed the kids out front for the press conference. It was the young people that thought of it, pursued it, and developed the whole thing. I'm sure they got help in how to write it up and create a budget, but it was their energy. They learned a very powerful lesson that goes way beyond skateboarding by doing that. To me, that's good youth development, good crime prevention. So how do you build something around youth development? We right now have an embarrassment of riches in terms of models. And when we were writing this report, we went through and found everyone that said they had a framework for youth development. This took me about 20 minutes, I think, to find all these frameworks. And I just got the logos and popped them up on the screen. And these are all great, but when you read the details, the one criticism I had of all these frameworks is that none of them seem to speak to the young people that we know. They all seem to be written for the 12-year-old Cub Scout or Boy Scout member who was doing well in school, who needed a little bit of after-school activity. They all assumed compliant behavior, the willingness to be there to listen to the adults. And I think what we need is a youth development framework that assumes that the kid's going to be in your face a lot. You're going to hear a lot of F-bombs. You're going to, you're not going to even talk about how they're wearing their pants because it's not relevant right now. A youth development model that's relevant for young people who are already court involved. And none of them quite made it to me. And when I discovered that, that's when we got the original impulse to write this report. So we know that there are good reasons to do this. We know that it's backed by good science. When you look at the science of adolescent development, building on strengths, building activities, focusing on relationships and attachment, it all is completely supported, and it's been around a long time. A judge recently said to me, "This is great. It's a wonderful new model." I said, "It's not new. It's the oldest model we have. We just don't do it very well." Every parent knows that when I go through all those lists of things about how to, protect a young person and get them moving toward survival, that's all you do all day long. But it's been an academic respectability for a long time. The social development model in Seattle, published a long time ago, is compatible with this. We know from looking at things like the survey of youth assets from Oklahoma, we know empirically that having positive assets in a young person's life is related to their ability to survive, to function, to flourish. These are all numbers that show that having positive assets cut the probability of risky behavior like carrying a weapon or using drugs and alcohol. And the most powerful thing is this survey measured 9 different positive assets, and when a kid had all 9 of them, they were only 1/5 as likely to report using drugs or alcohol. So we know this is true. The question is, this is correlational. How do we bring assets to a young person? We know if they have assets, they're in a better shape. They're more likely to survive, more likely to grow. But how do we deliver assets to someone whose environment is not doing that for them? And that's the key to making a good youth justice system. These numbers do the same thing. This is from the Search Institute. I'm sure you all know about the positive youth assets. And although that linear drop-off from left to right is just the probability of risky behaviors given the number of assets. So when you focus on the top one, it says problem alcohol use. As assets accumulate, the probability of risky alcohol use among young people goes from 45% down to 3. Now, when you look at the Search Institute's list of assets, I really find it hard to believe that a kid has more than 30 of them, anybody. But you can see that there's a correlation there. The question is cause. How do we build a youth justice system that can deliver assets to young people? And this is asking the justice system to operate in a very different way. I started off in youth justice, as Matt said. My first job was in Eugene, and I was a drug and alcohol counselor. And I was, just a dumb kid, and I did what my supervisors told me. Not that that always is a bad idea, but I was just doing what I was told. And I remember thinking, this doesn't make any sense to me. I went to high school in the 70s. I was somewhat aware of drugs and alcohol. And what we were telling them was, health behavior. Do you realize this could happen, and this could happen if you do this? And I knew that, teenagers don't think like that. But I was doing the program as it was delivered to me. And I think all of us that get involved in human services, we just sort of try to figure out what we're doing and how we fit into that system. But after a while, you start to realize there are certain presumptions that we have, certain assumptions. And this column called Traditional Justice, I think when you are honest about how we run our day-to-day business in youth justice, we're deficit-focused. We're risk-focused. The goal is control. We like a kid who does, who's compliant, doesn't cause trouble. We like it when we feel like we're controlling them now. We also like it when we can show that providing treatment is a deterrent effect. We think the way to get to them is like to first communicate to them that we're in charge, and if you keep this up, I'm going to come after you. I mean, that's the unspoken impulse of most youth justice. And so we use sanctions, supervision, and services. Well, what's the alternative to that? The alternative is, instead of focusing on deficits, focus on strengths, like the example I said before of music. I know I have a, my God, he's 17 now, 17-year-old nephew, whose entire world seems to revolve around cars. And when he found out I don't own a car anymore, I live in Manhattan, I said, I don't even miss it, I don't want a car anymore, and he just thought that was like the most unmanly thing he'd ever heard. And I tried to describe to him that at some point, a car just becomes, I said, when I was your age, I loved cars too, and at some points it just becomes a vehicle. It's not part of my identity, and of course he wasn't persuaded about that at all. But if I were trying to reach him, I would use the car. I would get him involved in car mechanics. I would, take him to a racetrack. I would do something connected with cars if I was trying to reach him. And that's just a natural impulse in a strength-based system. Focusing on attachment instead of control, building relationships instead of forcing them to submit to our authority, and connecting and engaging. Getting them actually involved in something, not just referring them. The contrast I usually make is not just travel agents, but tour guides. Not just here's your ticket, go see your treatment, but actually go with them, introduce them, sit through the first session. It's after school basketball program, play some basketball. Don't just drop them off and say I'll pick you up at 8. Really going the extra mile to engage. And then having our tactics be, what if we had a system whose primary tactic was reestablishing bonds with the community, connecting youth and family with pro-social activities, and focusing on building those assets and interests? It'd be a very different policy environment. And am I running out of time? Okay. I'll just go through this fast. These are numbers I usually present when I'm trying to make the point that we have to look past mental health and substance abuse. They're a piece of the problem. They're not a comprehensive solution. And the little mind experiment I usually ask is, imagine we had a perfect pill, a magic wand that wiped out all mental health and emotional problems among young people. How much crime would be left? How many delinquent kids would still be out there causing trouble? How many knuckleheads would we still have getting into scrapes if there were no more mental health issues and emotional problems? And sometimes I've asked people to do a raise the hands, and I've never heard anyone go under 40%. And some people say about 75% of all crime would still be with us if we had no more mental health issues. So it's a part of the puzzle. It increases the risk, and by the time you're looking at a deep end program where kids are locked up, you have a lot of mental health problems there. But that's a function of our decision making and sorting and sifting and allocating resources. It's not that mental health causes crime. I work less than a mile away from Wall Street, and I know that a lot of crime is caused by people with perfectly functional mental health systems. So there's an overlap, but it's often misused. And this is, I'll just go through this quickly. Linda Teplin did a study in Chicago in the detention center, and she found 69% of the kids in detention had a diagnosable disorder. That's important to know. But when you look at all adolescents, we know that that same prevalence number is about 21. And that 21% is not the same kids who are at risk of being in juvenile justice. These are all adolescents. These are kids who are excited about getting into Stanford next year. They're in that 21%. So there's a prevalence number that's different for kids in the deep end of the system. When we look at in between stages, so Gail Wasserman from Columbia screened young people as they hit the stage of probation intake, and at that point found 46% prevalence for all diagnosable disorders. And then something that comes close to the front door, it's not the police contact, but it's the first step after police. She looked at some of those juvenile assessment intake centers and found there the number was 29. So you can see that linear stepping up. You have more prevalence as we decide who to divert, who to hold off on prosecution, who to send home. All those decisions have an effect, and it just makes sense that we hold on to the kids with more obvious trouble. This is a more recent study from from Gail, and it shows that's the prevalence numbers for any mental health and substance use disorder, and on the right, those with substance use disorders. And you can see, if you just focus on the far right column, substance use, youth at intake are about 17% prevalence rate for substance use, which is not much different than the general population during adolescence. By the time you look at a detention center, you're up to 39, and in post-adjudication placements, about 47. And again, this makes sense. If you have 2 burglary cases, one of which involves a meth habit and one that doesn't, you're going to hold on to the meth case for services and placement. So it makes sense that you see that number climbing up. The problem is that people have drawn the incorrect inference and thought, now we know what causes crime, it's drug use and mental health problems. And basically we have to remember we're looking at 2 things that come together to create one phenomenon. We have kids coming from social and economic disadvantage, which increases the probability that they'll be given a mental health label or a substance use label, and increases the probability that they'll have justice system contact. And when those 2 things come together, you find a lot of kids from disadvantaged neighborhoods in the justice system with mental health and drug issues. But that's not to say if we could just fix mental health and drugs, we'd wipe out crime. We would help reduce crime, but it's not a global or a comprehensive solution. Okay, this is my last substantive argument for this point. When I first started working on this, I went to find all the studies that screened adolescents for mental health problems and controlled for socioeconomic status. And there were none. And I assume someone's doing them, but I haven't seen them yet. There are some on adults, however, and here's some examples. We know from decent studies that the odds of an adult reporting behavior that's consistent with a major depressive episode goes from 6% to 14% from people who have work to people who are unemployed. We know from the same kind of studies that higher education reduces the chances of being diagnosed with a mood disorder. We know income, and boy, this one makes a lot of sense to me. Mood disorders among high income, 6%, moderate, 9%, low income, almost 13%. So there's a correlation between socioeconomic status and the prevalence of detectable mental health diagnoses. Dysthymia, which is a mild, persistent form of anxiety, 2% among college or some college, 5% among high school, 12% among people less than a high school education. And again, trying to make it in this economy with less than a high school education would cause me anxiety too. And finally, by income, that same phenomenon, that anxiety disorder, dysthymia, 1% among high income, 5% among moderate, 9% among low income. So imagine, if you will, a system designed to scoop people out of the population for intervention that happens to pick up a lot of people from low income, disadvantaged, low educational achievement, stressful families. Why wouldn't we expect to see higher rates of mental health problems and substance abuse? But that's different than saying that's the key to reducing crime. And when we're talking about adolescent crime, you have to include these things, but you can't stop with mental health services and substance abuse. You have to build that into a total package, which to me says youth development. Okay. I'll just skip all that. This is another argument that you can look at later if you want, making the same point. so why do we hear so much about it? Why is there confusion? There are some organizations who are determined to mislead all of us. I guess I'm too polite or timid to name them. But I've seen reports coming out recently where the bold headline on the front cover was 75% of youth in the juvenile justice system have mental health disorders. It's a flat-out lie, unless they have an asterisk that said, of course, by juvenile justice system, we mean locked facilities. And maybe that is what they meant. But I can tell you from talking to people and then asking them, my truth test is always just to show someone and say, what do you think? What do you make of this? What does this say to you? And when people read that, especially people who are not in our field, they don't hear the word juvenile justice system and think deep end locked facilities. They think kids in trouble, kids in court. So it's misleading. And there are people who are basically looking to get paid who are making that case that it's all about mental health. And we have to be very cautious about that. So we tried to write this report to address some of these things. And we tried to make a positive case that again, that call that comes in the middle of the night from your 14-year-old. And I remember my parents had that experience when the police called, I think it was 2:30 in the morning, and informed them that my brother and I were both at the booking station waiting to be picked up because we committed the brilliant crime of siphoning gas out of a truck parked along the road under a streetlight because we wanted someplace we could see. And by the way, since it was going to take a while, we left the car doors open with the stereo playing because we wanted some entertainment. And then we're shocked when suddenly the police pulled up with the lights going. And my mother asked me once how I got involved in this, and I said, I think it was that moment, actually. The police were decent to us. We met with a probation officer who was incredibly decent, even had a sense of humor, who said, you know, if you were a year older, you'd be in really, deep right now. You're lucky that you're 16. And we had to pay restitution, and I'll show you how old I am. They estimated we stole 3 gallons of gas that we had to write a check for at a rate of 36 cents a gallon. And they were smart enough to say, no, we're not just going to have you drop off the check. You take this down to the highway department, because it was a highway, it was a construction site, and the truck was parked there overnight. So we had to go up and knock on the door and get the check and tell them why. And I bet the probation officer called ahead, because we didn't have to explain. They sort of knew why we were there, which is just fantastic. So we had the experience of this highway department not being judgmental, but also not being funny about it. That was the night I learned that I couldn't always make my dad laugh, because he was not finding this funny. So everyone kind of worked together to make sure that we did not see this as a trivial thing, and there was a consequence for it. And it was all done informally and totally adjusted. And I just thought, and I was, I guess at that time, interested in social science enough to have that reflection that this could have turned out really differently had we not had, if we didn't have that particular officer, that particular probation worker, and both my brother and I, we grew up with educated parents. We could kick in that vocabulary immediately when we got put in the back of that car, and we were respectful and, not in an ingratiating way, but we knew how to be the appropriate contrite adolescents. At least we had learned how to do that. And I would call that a social asset, knowing how to behave. So we turned all that on, and we were rewarded for it. And I think realizing that even at that time, I have a friend I still wonder about. I look for him sometimes on the internet and Facebook, and I worry that he's probably no longer living. And he did not have those kind of assets. We were all doing the same stuff, and he was just in a different context. And I think realizing those differences is where my interest in this whole field came from. And I bet you a lot of you are in this field for the exact same reason. And I meet people all the time. It takes a while to relax and start to admitting things, and you leak little facts about your own adolescence, and pretty soon you're in safe territory, and then the stories come out. And a lot of us get hooked into this field because we realize either how close we came, or we even got involved in it and somehow we're able to extract ourselves. And you want to turn around, you want to pay that back. And to me, paying attention to adolescent development, trying to build that positive system, that kind of wraparound approach that kind of grabs that kid and says, we're here for you, and we're not just trying to control you, but we want to show you how great life can be without getting high and without taking these chances. Let us turn you on to a few things. That should be youth justice. And so I'm really pleased to be here. And to read about what this foundation is doing, and it seems like a great kickoff, and I look forward to keeping in touch and hearing about how it all turns out. Thank you very much.
So we are going to go ahead and open the mic to some folks that may have some questions for Jeff while we have his time today.
Thank you for a very interesting, provocative, thought-provoking talk. Really liked a lot of what you had to say. I'm with the Restorative Schools Vision Project, and we are also part of the National Dignity in Schools campaign. One of our main concerns is what's called the school-to-prison pipeline, school-to-jailhouse track. And one of the factors we've identified as critical in that pipeline that you did not mention, which I would like to know how you think it interfaces, is disproportionate minority contact. Would you be able to comment on an overlay, if you will, of disproportionate minority contact and the part that plays in your analysis?
You can't be in the justice system for more than 5 minutes without recognizing that there's an issue. You can't tour any facility, any camp, any program without recognizing that. The one difference, or maybe point where I step back from some of the DMC community within youth justice, is I think we're sometimes a little too politically savvy and not as realistic as we should be about where all this comes from. And the way I always describe it, I can say this here, if you think about the data distribution of inequities and discrimination within the justice process, it looks like the Golden Gate Bridge. So it's really high at arrest, it comes way down during screening cases, prosecution, adjudication, and it comes back up at the moment of placement. Well, those two peaks at the front door and the end are where the system is really connected to the community. So what I see is the justice system is reflecting that we live in a racially discriminatory, racist society, and when the distribution of economic resources is related to ethnicity, race, language of origin, you're going to have disparate populations hitting the front door of that system. If we had a perfect justice system that was completely equitable and non-discriminatory, it still might look like the Golden Gate Bridge. Because when you get to the end of the process and it's time to think up an intervention package for a young person, and that young person has resources in the community and people stepping up, the placement rate's going to be lower than if they come from a disadvantaged area, neighborhood family. Our job is to make sure that the peaks of that bridge are as low as possible, and that the system I just described of having no inequities in it is an actual fact. But the problem I have with the whole DMC agenda is when people use the two easy numbers. X% of the population are youth of color in general, and X% of the justice population are youth of color. It's a difference, therefore, look how racist we are. And I think that's just too easy. And I think the longer you work in the system, you know you have to look past those numbers and be a little more sophisticated about how you analyze them. But obviously, I mean, the justice system in America is about racial discrimination. So I mean, this is so obvious that it's something we have to continually attend to, but I think it's unfair for people to characterize one jurisdiction as worse than another because the shape of the bridge is slightly different when it's America, folks. That's my position.
Thank you, Dr. Butts, for that presentation. And so, you know, I think as a foundation that's invested in youth development, positive youth justice fits nicely. For systems leaders and nonprofit organizations in the community, figuring out how a positive youth justice approach would fit, you know, I've heard from you, it doesn't always fit so nicely. But don't worry, we'll get there. We'll make it fit nicely by your commitment, your leadership, and the support that Sierra Health Foundation will provide, not only the grant support, but the technical support to help coach jurisdictions interested in the positive youth justice approach. So thank you, Jeff, for that context. If you haven't checked out Jeff's report, I would really encourage you to Google search it. It's the first thing that pops up, even before Positive Youth Justice Initiative. But you know, it is what helped help shape and help mold the Sierra Health Foundation's Positive Youth Justice Initiative. You have it within your packet, the background piece on our initiative. Today we're not going into the design. We know you're interested. You've already researched the Positive Youth Justice Initiative design, so we assume you are schooled in that. All those resources are available on our website if you're not schooled in the design elements of the Positive Youth Justice Initiative. And we're happy to answer any questions over lunch. If you have them, feel free to find me, and we can help answer those questions. The way our afternoon's going to look is we have our partners from the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice and the San Francisco Juvenile Probation Department here, who's going to talk about one of the other design elements of the initiative, wraparound, and talk about leveraging and optimizing resources, funding streams around EPSDT and wraparound. And then we'll actually get into some planning time for you. The last convening we held, the kickoff, we saw the county teams already huddling up and trying to figure out, is this something that we're interested in pursuing, and that's why you're here. We're going to designate some time to help give you a tool and kind of walk you through that tool to give you some time, and we'll have some partners in the room to help answer any questions.